My name is Bastien Llamas. I work at the University of Adelaide, and my research, my expertise is in the study of DNA. So I'm what we call a genomicist. Okay. It's probably a word that you have heard about already. It stands for complicated couple of words that I'm not going to say right now. But what it is really, it's the book of life. And in that book, you have a story written, and that's the genetic information, basically. Um, DNA is transmitted from the parents to the offsprings. And basically, as we go from a generation to another, back into the past, we tell not only a story about yourself, but we also tell a story about your parents, your peoples, and the whole of humans around the world. So why do I study DNA? Why am I interested in DNA? It goes back into my studies, really like undergraduate studies, where I explored many different things: physics, chemistry, um, informatics, and then at some point I started to do biology as well. And genetics just clicked with me. There's a certain logic around the transmission of particular traits, like the color of the eyes, for example, the color of the skin. And there's mathematics behind it, basically. And then if you start thinking about more complex traits, like, for example, I don't know, your height. This is more than one gene that is going to say do something about your height, or some diseases like heart disease, for example, or type 2 diabetes, for example, where there is a complex interaction of multiple genes. So genes are the units of information in your DNA, and the environment as well. Then suddenly it becomes extremely complicated, and you do need math. You do need to model basically what's happening, so you can better predict the outcome of the genetic information you carry. So as you can see, I mean, I'm interested in DNA not only because it's a cool molecule and it does some fantastic stuff, but it's also because it allows me to use other scientific disciplines to study it. Why would it be important to study DNA for you kids? Um, it's really because, like I said, it's the blueprint of a lot of things that make us us, and how we interact with our environment. With bugs, with disease, but also how similar we are actually across the whole of humanity. People living in Australia, in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, in Europe, we all carry DNA. And we all carry that human story in us. So much so that actually 99.9% of that story is common between all of us. So the little differences that you see between people, they count for nothing, really. DNA tells us that we're all one. We're all human, basically. There is one thing that is really cool that happened only a few years ago, really, during my research. And not necessarily my own research, but that of colleagues in Europe. We think ourselves as humans. Okay. We look at each other. Yes, we can recognize that we're all humans. But there were some other humans living on Earth 40, 50,000 years ago and beyond. And they're our cousins, basically. They're called Neanderthals, and some are called Denisovans. It turns out that with the study of ancient DNA, so DNA that we retrieve from the archaeological remains found in the ground, in caves, we can sequence all of the DNA of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Remember, they have not lived on Earth for the past 40, 50,000 years, okay? And it turns out that when you look at that information, and you look at the DNA information in me, for example, you will find some of that Neanderthal story in my DNA. So sometimes in the past, there's been an encounter between a human and Neanderthal. They had some children, and I am a product of this encounter. That was really something we could not know without sequencing that DNA story from Neanderthal and Denisovans. So that's really something that I find extremely cool, personally. Working on country, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on the research that I do, which is about DNA, genomics, was actually extremely enriching because there are many links between that story that DNA tells about humanity and the stories that you find in the songlines from the different communities I've been working with. There is something about the origins of humans. There is something about how humans interact with their environment. And there is something about the future, the legacy, basically, that we leave to our children and their children and so on. There's many commonalities between DNA and the traditional stories amongst the indigenous peoples in Australia. And for that, I've always had a lot of engagement with people regarding all of this. At the same time, the DNA story can be used. It can be used for good, can be used for bad. And usually in communities, there is always a little bit of apprehension, I would say, regarding any work linked to DNA, because that information can tell something about your strength, but it can maybe say something about some perceived weaknesses. You know, for example, maybe you are going to be more sensitive to a particular disease. And if you let the media run with that idea, they might actually, at the end of the day, stigmatize people who, you know, carry that genetic information that may be harmful today. All of this is also due to a long history, you know, of harm being done to indigenous peoples in Australia, where scientists have been working with them for the purpose of their own research, really, but not for the purpose of helping communities. But it turns out that DNA can be used to really help communities. One main thing that I'm doing at the moment with peoples in the Kimberley is working around how can we reconnect the ancestors, the dead people, and the living. Because there's been some skeletal remains found in the burial ground. We do not know yet who they are, but there's people, living people in the community who know that it's someone that is a relative, that is connected to them. So now the idea that we have with that community, and it's really something that we co-designed, we work together really to develop that, is to look at the DNA information in the ancestors, the DNA information in the living people, and then to try and see if we can match and find those family relationships. Why is it important? It's because those skeletal remains were found in a burial ground that may not be country. It may, you know, be some people who were living hundreds of kilometers away and then have been buried here. And the idea is to bring them back to country, basically. So working on country with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples about DNA, okay, like about developing research topics using DNA, brought me to Gunakonai country in East Gippsland, in Eastern Victoria. And over there, the community has a very active research program around the conservation of biodiversity, the animals and the plants, about as well the management of the land using fire, and also, very simply, about their story, okay? And I have been working with them now for a couple of years, where we are going to an archaeological site and then looking at the DNA information that is present in the sediments. So, you have a deposition of soil over time, and then if you start digging, the deeper soil tells a story about the deepest times, okay? And then looking at the DNA information, we can reconstruct what's happening in terms of the presence of plants, of animals, and of microbes. And the changes eventually that happen over time can tell us something about climate change, about environmental change, even before the current climate change that we know today. Of course, they do have stories about the past, okay? There's been transmissions of stories from generations to another, and they do have stories about some animals being present on the landscape, for example, or some flooding event, or some big fires, And we can try and put that together with the DNA story, and then try and see if there is overlaps, differences, and for them, it's really another way, basically, of telling their own stories. Plus, think about the fact that, 200 or so years ago, Europeans arrived, and then they started to farm, they started to modify a little bit the landscape, meaning that what we see today of Australia might not be the Australia that was existing 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or beyond. So using DNA and many other scientific tools, we can eventually help understanding how it was before the arrival of Europeans. So of course, working on country means that I'm building relationships with the peoples living on country. So I have a lot of colleagues at first, that are part of the community, they become friends. And it's a beautiful relationship because there is an exchange of knowledge. I am a white dude, okay? I mean, you can hear that my accent is not from Australia. I was born in France. I traveled around the world and lived in many places. And then I landed in Australia, in a country that I did not know much about, to be fair. And then I learned about the history of the country during European colonization, but also before. And working on country really connects me with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I mostly listen, basically. This is all about learning about other ways of being, living, thinking, and then to really exchange, about what I know about DNA, and then what they know about themselves and country, and try and find ways sometimes to simply answer questions that they're all interested in, basically. So I find that extremely enriching, personally and professionally. So it's always full of beautiful stories, yes.